Philosophy and Seeing Together. Part 1. Epigraphs. Iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens the countenance of a friend. There is no writing of mine about these matters, nor will there ever be one, for this knowledge is not something that can be put into words like other sciences. But after long continued intercourse between teacher and pupil, in joint pursuit of the subject, suddenly, like a light flashing forth when a fire is kindled, it is born in the soul, and straightway nourishes itself. The way up is the way down. Part 2. On Seeing Together. It is very important that you attend every class, that you come prepared, and that you participate. I imagine you can think of several reasons this is true, but I want to suggest one reason that is not often considered. There are some things that can only be seen well when they are seen together with other people. Among these are the most intelligible realities aimed at by the best philosophy. In conversation with the texts we are reading, and in conversation with each other, it is our goal as a class to make these realities more evident to each other. I want to give you a basic sense of what I mean when I say that some things are only seen well when they're seen together. This is not something limited to philosophy. Many things are only seen well when they're seen together. Sometimes you can only really see humor when you see it with others who see you seeing it. Sometimes you can only really see yourself when you see together with others. Sometimes you can only see an injustice when you see it together with others who call to your mind the victims of that injustice. The reason you see differently when you see with other people is not just that they might actively point things out to you. The presence of other people affects the way you see things, even when they do not say anything. Think of the difference between watching a comedy alone and watching it with other friends who share your sense of humor. You can see the humor more evidently not because your friend explains it to you as you go. Explanations kill jokes. But because you are at one and the same time experiencing the comedy and experiencing your friends experiencing the comedy with you. Or think of what would happen if you were behaving in a cruel way to another person and then, suddenly, became aware that someone you deeply admire and respect is right there in the room with you. Before this awareness, you were able to hide your own behavior from yourself. But once you see that the person you admire is there with you, your own cruelty shows up to you, and you cannot ignore it. It is not necessary for the person you admire to say anything. It is not even necessary for you to see an expression on this person's face. It is enough to know that the other person is there. The reason you see differently when you see with other people is that those other people bring their entire perspectives to bear on what is seen. This is important to keep in mind when you're preparing for class and when you have conversations with your peers. Your contribution to our shared work of thinking cannot be replaced by a robot, an automaton that only generates strings of words. Of course, your words matter, and they matter because of how they shed light on the things for the rest of us. But still, your words need to grow out of your own mind and work. They cannot be a mere repetition of something said elsewhere. Part 3. On the inner worth of our knowledge and its usefulness. The kind of knowledge we're aiming at in this class has its own inner worth. It elevates us in our humanity. It is the health of our intellect. And our intellect is our noblest part. It will not be a surprise if something which is worthwhile on its own also turns out to be useful. For example, as a human being, your life has its own inner worth. But the way you live your life, we may hope, will also be useful to others. In the same way, we may hope that whatever is gained by a sustained study of philosophy will also be useful. History supports us in this hope. Most of the great strides in useful knowledge have been made by people who first delighted in contemplation for its own sake. Ancient geometers took their discoveries in geometry to be divine, with no thought that their work would be needed for great projects in engineering. At a more personal level, it is certainly to be expected that if you come to delight in good philosophy, it had better be good. You will be better able to reason about all kinds of things. But I want to discourage you from instrumentalizing your studies here. The work we are here to do will not go well if we are constantly looking over our shoulders at an imaginary manager who wants us to catalog all of our progress in spreadsheets and graphs, demonstrating the effects of something called critical reasoning skills on company profits. It's the same with anything of inner worth. If you have a good friend, a friend of the most genuine sort, it's to be expected that your friend will also be willing to help you when you need help. But if you turn all your attention to the ways your friend can be used for moving your couches from house to house, for writing you letters of recommendation, for teaching you how to make spreadsheets and graphs for your manager, or anything else that your friend might be useful for, if you turn all your attention to that, you will no longer really see your friend. And that harms the friendship. To see your friend well, as your friend really is, you need to see beyond what is useful and to see someone delightful. Part 4. On the best philosophical conversations and approximations of the same. At least concerning one part of what we're trying to see, here is something true. The inner worth of this seeing is intimately related to the fact that we are seeing it together. By seeing it together, we are, in an imperfect way, uniting the most universal with the most concrete kind of knowledge. The principles we're aiming at are most universal. Whether we succeed or not, the striving of philosophy is a striving towards universal principles. The philosopher's path is the way up to these principles. For example, the philosopher of language does not focus on what Ed and Sally talked about at the local cafe last Saturday afternoon, unless their particular conversation might illuminate some general principle about the nature of language. Straining every nerve up to universal principles is part of our charge as human beings. But the way down, the people who join us in this work, who work with us in philosophical conversation, and here I include the authors of the texts we read, are concrete individuals. When we talk philosophy with them, we come closer to understanding them as individuals. The very best philosophical conversations are those that are had among perfect friends working their way together towards universal principles, and in this way uniting the most universal with the most concrete knowledge. Not every conversation will be the very best. As with any work worth doing, we make progress only in fits and starts, learning to welcome pain, boredom, frustration, and failure, assured that pain, boredom, frustration, and failure will not have the last word so long as we keep trying. But you ought to give some thought to the very best philosophical conversations and ask yourself, what are the conditions needed in order to make them possible? What can be done so that the work we do together can approach the ideal. Here is an incomplete list: being prepared, being consistent, and being trustworthy. Part 5, on the conditions needed for good philosophical conversation. Being prepared. After you do the reading, you need to let the ideas of the reading live playfully in your mind. When you go on your afternoon hike, or when you're in the shower, or when you're stargazing, or when you're watching the sunrise, drinking strong black coffee long before anyone else is awake, let the ideas in your mind dance with each other. If you do this, you will often find that when your attention is turned elsewhere, while you sleep at night, the same ideas will have the privacy they need to make new ideas, baby ideas. And when you wake up, you will find little inklings. But your thoughts must not be given over to play all the time. You must also test them. Test the inklings with tests fitting for inklings, and test fully grown ideas with tests fitting for fully grown ideas. If an idea does not pass the test, you have two options. If you're convinced that there is no hope that this idea, however well developed it may be, might still prove useful one day, cast it out of your mind, let it have no home there. But if you feel maybe one day it might develop into something good, even though you yourself don't know how to help it along, send it to the outskirts of your mind. Give it instructions. Only return when you have developed. In either case, let ideas that do not pass the test make room for better ideas. Ideas are there to help you and to help others to see things the way they really are and to see it well. And maybe also, if this is different, to help you and others to act well in the world. Give ideas a chance to prove themselves. But if they prove they can't help with this work, give them their leave. If you do this as you prepare for our conversations, you will become a better conversation partner. You will ask better questions, make better distinctions, and generally have more interesting and more helpful things to say. Of course, it is not helpful to allow your mind to think about just any random subject. What we read together determines our focus. The reading sets the topic of conversation. And so it is vitally important that you read, and read well. Being consistent. In an ideal world, we would continue a conversation with the same people over years or decades. In a conversation that spans a lifetime, we develop a more refined vocabulary. We develop stories, images that help us think better. A conversation can only develop if the same people are part of it consistently. If we only have one college term together, consistency is even more important. You have to attend every meeting. There are a lot of reasons this is important, but the main reason is probably not the one you're used to hearing. You're probably used to hearing, you owe it to yourself to take advantage of chances to learn. That may be true, but I see two problems with focusing on this reason. The first is it's too easy to brush aside when it's inconvenient. It's easy to say, yes, I owe it to myself, but I can be very forgiving. The second problem is that it misses what is most essential. We are meeting together as one unified class in order to take part in the same conversation. The fact that we're in the same room together is not accidental to the work we're here to do. The fundamental reason you need to be here consistently is that you owe it to everyone else who is trying to have this conversation. When we miss the meetings, the conversation is interrupted. We miss chances to fall into the rhythms that bring about the most exciting discoveries. being trustworthy. Remember this proverb: iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens the countenance of a friend. One person sharpens another. But if others are going to let you sharpen them in conversation, they need to be able to trust you. And so you will need to be worthy of that trust. They need to be able to trust you will criticize ideas, but not attack persons. They need to be able to trust that you will help them develop their ideas and then test their ideas. They need to be able to trust that you yourself will be willing to put forward your thoughts and be willing to be proven wrong. Don't be too attached to your ideas just because they're yours. When your conversation partners are at home preparing for their meeting together, they might think about you and think about questions they will want to ask you. If they're going to form these questions, they need to be able to trust that you will have thought about the reading yourself and that you will take their questions seriously, helping them to work through the inquiry. Part 6. How one person sharpens another for understanding texts. There are at least 4 ways that you can sharpen other persons for the purpose of understanding philosophical questions and texts. First, in your distinct questions and observations. Second, in your absolute particularity. Third, in your adopted conversational roles, the metaphorical hats you wear. And fourth, in your absence, in the way that your voice is remembered and anticipated, even while it is not present. First, in your distinct questions and observations. The most obvious and most frequent way you can sharpen your conversation partners is by raising questions or making observations that could have been made or raised by anybody else, but which were not. You were the one that made them, and so we are very lucky that you did. Second, in your absolute particularity. By your absolute particularity, I mean those things that are particular to you as an individual, things that would need to be included in your biography, things that would need to be known about you in order to understand you as a person. Maybe in high school you read Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, and you made it your entire personality for a year. Or maybe you have a tendency to understand the world with rugby analogies. Or maybe you spent time in Australia learning to play the didgeridoo. When you come to the conversation, you bring your entire perspective to bear on the text. Because of your absolute particularity, no one else is ever in a position to read the text in precisely the way that you, at this moment, can do. This does not mean that you get to put things into the text that are not there, but it does mean that you are in a position to help your conversation partners make discoveries that they would not have made without you. Third, in your adopted conversational roles, your different hats. What do I mean by different hats or different conversational roles? There are important tasks that need to be done in reading a text well, and the conversation can divide up those tasks in an informal and fluid sort of division of labor. We might think of wearing different hats. At one point, you wear the hat of the paradox finder, discovering various tensions in the text, trying to resolve them. Or at another point, you wear the hat of the textualist, trying to interpret one text in light of another, to see how one illuminates the other. At another point, you wear the hat of the theorist, trying to take a view of the whole, stepping back, creatively thinking about how it is that all of these parts can fit together. Another point, you wear the hat of the evaluator, asking, but is it a good argument? Does it work? And so on. And fourth, in your absence. I've had a lot of good philosophical conversations with friends in my life. So whenever I read a new text, I can hear them in my mind. One friend raises an objection. Another nods his head or asks a question with just a distinctive cadence. In my memory, my friends continue to contribute to the way I see the world, but they also make contributions in the way that I anticipate speaking to them in the future. I read a text knowing that I am going to speak to my friends soon, and I wonder what they would have to say about it. I formulate questions in my mind for them specifically. Getting to this position takes time, but this is all the more reason to prepare yourselves for having the best conversations while you are present. If you do, you can continue to make contributions even when you are absent. Part 7. Reading as expansion. One reason it's important for us to speak with each other about what we read is that reading is expansion. Reading is expansion, writing is compression. We often talk about writing the wrong way. We talk as if the purpose of writing is simply a matter of moving fully formed thoughts from one place to another. According to this way of talking, thoughts first live in the writer's head, and then the writer moves them to scraps of paper until the reader picks up those scraps of paper and puts the ideas into their head. This is not correct. When I write, I externalize my thoughts so that I can enter into dialogue with myself. By means of this dialogue, I sharpen my own thinking, and I do this in order to be able to draw my reader's attention to something so that they can see more clearly. Readers are then able to enter into dialogue with the text, and in the best of circumstances, with each other. And when the text is a great text, that is, when the text is rich with meaning, readers can enter into the dialogue with the very same text indefinitely many times. Each time becomes a new dialogue with the text, and in that way is always able to draw us readers to attend to something new. That is why people who read great texts will tell you that the meaning of the text is never fully comprehended, because they find something new and meaningful each time they encounter it. Not every text is rich with meaning in this way. If you send a quick email to set up a meeting, there's a sense in which your reader enters into dialogue with the text you've written, but it's not the sort of dialogue that you can return to multiple times in edifying ways. And some school textbooks are like this as well. They lack this sort of richness. Textbooks of this sort intend to teach some fixed amount of information, and once you have that fixed amount of information firmly in mind, there's nothing to be gained by returning to the text. But the best philosophical texts are rich with meaning. Each time you return to them, you have the opportunity to interact with them and to learn from them in a new way, because you yourself change, and so you bring a new perspective to bear on the text. And so reading well is always expansion. Of all the great texts in the history of philosophy, in the history of literature, in the history of natural science or theology, I can think of countless that are commentaries on other texts. I cannot think of one that is a mere summary. That's not to suggest that summaries are unimportant, but it is to suggest that the summary is never the final aim of our dialogues. One of the easiest ways to see this is to think about ordinary conversations with friends. Your friend makes a point. You summarize your friend's point. But why do you do this? Why do you take the time to repeat what your friend has said in summary fashion? It's not to put a stop to the conversation, but to check that you're following your friend. Check that you're following your friend well enough to make your own contributions and to carry the conversation forward. When you enter dialogue with each other about any text which is rich with meaning, you should not think that the ultimate goal of your conversation is to produce the final and exhaustive word on the subject. Progress is made, the world is seen more clearly, and some answers are given in a settled way. But there will always be more to see, more clarity to be gained, and as often as not, our settled answers serve to direct our attention to new and deeper questions. Part 8. Practical advice for class discussion. To complete this lecture, I want to offer about 13 pieces of practical advice for class discussion. The broad purpose of our discussion will be to discover what we can learn from whatever text we have read. Thinking is a group project. A good conversation can lead to discoveries for the entire group which could never have been made, even by the smartest people working on their own. A. Even though summarizing is never the ultimate goal of a discussion, trying to summarize part of the text is one good way of getting a conversation going, and this can be useful for several reasons. First, it might be that not everybody has the same understanding of what the text means. There might be some disagreement about how it could be accurately summarized, and it's really helpful to uncover those disagreements right from the beginning. Second, sometimes when we read a text, we feel like we understand its meaning, but then we find ourselves unable to actually explain it to somebody else. Making the effort can help us to correct this mistake. Third, sometimes it's useful to summarize a text even when the meaning is entirely clear to everybody. Everybody agrees about what it says. But doing this can help to remind people about things they thought were interesting. And so it can give everybody a chance to breathe and think about how they would like to respond. B. Appreciation is an underrated art. It is worthwhile taking time to acknowledge specific parts of the text that seemed especially interesting or insightful to you. If we're going to learn from the author, we should go truth-seeking, but be specific in your appreciation. C. Don't forget to look for arguments in the text. An argument is a set of statements consisting of premises and a conclusion. The premises are statements that aim to support the conclusion. The conclusion is what is allegedly supported by the statements. If an author makes a claim, don't just recognize what the claim means, but do that. Also, look for why the author thinks it's true. D. Be willing to disagree with the author. Keep in mind, there are a few ways you can disagree. First, the author might say something that you find counterintuitive, even though you don't really know why you find it counterintuitive. For example, say an author says, well, of course, there's never any good reason to kill a living organism. And you hear this and you think, there's something wrong with this statement. But it might take you some time to think about exactly why it's wrong. And it's worth mentioning this to the class because someone else might say, I think I can help. Your friend might offer the following helpful suggestion. I agree with you that the author is mistaken here, and here's why. There are often very good reasons to kill a living organism. For example, we kill living organisms when we use antibiotics. Second way, you might already know why you disagree with the author, and in cases like this, it could be useful to share that with the class. Third, it's also possible to agree with the conclusion, but disagree with the author's argument in favor of the conclusion. So, for example, the author, perhaps the same author, says, murder is always wrong because there is never a good reason to kill a living organism. Here, the conclusion is that murder is always wrong, which seems pretty plausible. But one of the author's premises is that there is never a good reason to kill a living organism, which is false. There must be some other reason to think that murder is always wrong. E. Be willing to disagree with each other. When you disagree with your classmates, it can give all of you the opportunity to clarify, to refine your own positions. And in the absolute best cases, you can achieve a perfect meeting of the minds and get rid of the disagreement altogether. But even when you don't do this, it's still possible to make important discoveries about where the heart of the disagreement lies. F. If you feel frustrated, confused, say so. Keep in mind, if you're confused about something, it's likely that somebody else is too. Ask for clarification. It's helpful for everyone. If you think the conversation needs to take a different direction, say so. Take responsibility. When you agree with your classmates, try to add something. Don't just say, I agree with 100% of what you said, that's that. Instead, say, I agree with that, and I think it supports, or I agree with that, but I think we should add a qualification, or something along those lines. H. If you happen to know what the teacher thinks, don't be afraid to disagree with the teacher. I. Don't be afraid of being wrong. Don't be afraid of occasional failures. Take risks. J. Look for connections between one part of the text and another. K. Look for possible tensions between one part of the text and another. For example, you might say, At the beginning of the reading, the author says that P, but then, a few chapters later, the author says that Q. Doesn't Q contradict P? Am I missing something? Can P and Q somehow be made compatible with each other? Trying to work through these apparent tensions can lead to very interesting discoveries. L. Ask open-ended questions. But ask genuine questions. Do not prepare your questions as if you are writing an essay prompt. Prepare questions which you would genuinely like to see answered. If you find that a particular reading just doesn't interest you at all, try a couple things. First, at least to yourself, try to articulate why you don't find it interesting. For example, the author just seems to be arguing that the sun rises in the east. Obviously, the sun rises in the east, but everybody knows this. What is the purpose of spending like 6 pages on this? And then be willing to share this question with the class. Second, sometimes it's useful to use the following formulaic question. I understand that X, but what's exactly at stake here? For example, so imagine that an author seems to be spending a lot of time arguing that pleasure is not a process. One pretty natural response to this reading would be, hey, I'm willing to grant that pleasure is not a process, but what is at stake? Why does the author think it is important to prove this? When we try to answer this question, we might discover, for example, there were people who claimed that pleasure was a process, and those people used that claim to advise others to let their desires to grow without limit. Third, it's not a good idea to fake an interest in the reading, but you can actively take an interest in the reading, even if you don't find it speaking to you. Imagine yourself in the shoes of the author. Imagine your shoes in a variety of different readers who might find something interesting or valuable, and then ask the text questions from those perspectives. And finally, M. Do not assume that religious or cultural differences always create insurmountable barriers for learning. For example, if you are an atheist and the author starts talking about God or gods, don't automatically assume it's impossible for you to learn anything valuable from this author. The same holds if you're a theist reading an author who is an atheist, or if you're a committed defender of free speech reading a lover of censorship. Part 9. Conclusion. If we follow all of these principles, it will lead to fruitful, edifying, and memorable conversations. You are needed here.